Hello, listeners, and welcome back to Burn Your Draft, the podcast exploring the Reed College senior thesis process. I'm Ace Lackey, your podcast producer. In today's episode, Avis Correa returns as host, interviewing Hannah Goodman on loving her thesis and not loving the oysters therein.
My name is Hannah. I'm originally from a small town in southern Maine called Bath. My department was Sociology, and my thesis was called Change Adaptation Strategies in Maine Oyster Aquaculture, and my thesis advisor was Mark Snyberg.
So you went back to Maine for your thesis?
Part of it, yeah. When I was picking my thesis topic, I eventually, after I decided that I wanted to do something in aquaculture and figured out that I was probably going to be with oysters, I had to decide whether or not I was going to study in Oregon or if I was going to study in Maine, being that those were like the two places that were convenient for me to study at. And I had a high school teacher who is very beloved to me, who is an oyster farmer. So I was like, well, she's a starting place I could go to and ask questions about. So I ended up picking Maine because I had contacts there. And when you explain it in your thesis, there has to be other reasons. But the primary way I got there in the first place was I had a starting point. So I was actually in Maine for a part of it. My thesis was interview-based. So I did approximately half of them the first semester. So I did 10 interviews the first semester. And then when I went home for winter break, I did 8 more. I had a lot of interviews. I was on top of that. When I was collecting or hunting for participants, one of the things they tell you is just reach out to everybody that you can, because usually response rates are quite low for theses, especially my interviews were an hour long. So that's a pretty big time commitment to be asking people for, especially when there's not an incentive. Like the sociology department, I don't think that they allow incentives because it makes it really hard to go through IRB board. So what I did was I went on the Department of Marine Resources, which is the people who sign out aquaculture leases to farmers, and I sorted by oyster farmer, and I emailed everybody on the list that I could find an email for, and there's 150 farms in Maine. So I think I probably emailed 70 people. So having an 18-person response rate is actually pretty high. And admittedly, not all my interview participants were farmers. I also was trying to get a broader perspective on industry, so I was also talking to people from research institutes and trade associations and community nonprofits to try and get a little bit more of a holistic view of the industry.
Could you explain a little bit more, what was the context of your thesis? What were you aiming to do? So
I was interested in climate change, and that's something that I've always been really passionate about. And one thing, the sociology department doesn't have an environmental studies program. And when I originally came to Reed, I was an ES poli-sci major. And when I found out that I actually kind of hated poli-sci and switched to sociology, it made me really sad that they didn't have an ES program. And I was like, I'm going to write an ES thesis, and they can't stop me. I will fight them on that. So I was interested in pursuing something with climate justice. My thesis actually started out as a gender thesis. It wasn't until probably 2 or 3 weeks into the process that I had a conversation with my advisor, and I was trying to ask these questions about why is it that aquaculture has such a high percentage of participation of women relative to wild catch fishing industries, specifically the lobster industry. That's the big one in Maine. So it started out as that, and as I was asking these questions and starting to think about what I wanted my thesis to be and how I was going to shape those questions, my advisor eventually was every single time we're in a meeting, you come back to climate change and you're asking questions about climate change and you're trying to write a gender thesis. Why are you trying to write a gender thesis when clearly what you want to talk about is climate change? And I was like, that's a really good point. So I ended up redesigning all my questions to kind of deal with this gap that I was seeing in the literature, which is essentially there's a decent amount of literature on adaptation in the wild catch industry, especially lobsters, because Maine has one of the fastest warming bodies of water in the world, the Gulf of Maine. It rose 3 degrees Celsius, I want to say, in the last few years, which is crazy. Maybe don't quote me on that exact statistic because I don't remember, but the real statistic is in my thesis. So there's all this literature about the lobsters, which are going into deeper waters, are starting to migrate north and causing all these problems in the fishing industry. And the economy, like the fishing economy in Maine, is upwards of 90% based on lobster fishery. So that's a really big problem for a lot of people's economic livelihoods. And I was interested in what was going on in aquaculture, which is relatively new. It only arrived in the 70s to US, and Maine was one of the first hubs where it started kind of trickling in as a commercial thing. Aquaculture has been around since Native Americans, but we're not being colonized yet. But that's a different story. I kind of arrived at this question because I was looking at how the fishing industry has a whole bunch of literature on how people are adapting to it. And I was like, well, one of the major adaptations is switching into aquaculture. But then I started talking to farmers and I was like, there's so many problems that people in aquaculture are also facing. And there's not a lot of literature on how people are adapting to it. I think I maybe only found one article that was here's a list of adaptations that people in aquaculture are using, which is crazy to me because aquaculture is huge around the world and it's starting to become a bigger part of the US fishing industry or seafood industry. So I was like, well, how are the farmers adapting? Because they're going to be seeing these struggles too as weather becomes more volatile and the waters rise, bringing in these new bacterias and invasive species. So how are the farmers adapting and are they doing it successfully? So I eventually arrived on the question through a lot of my deliberation back and forth with my advisor, was this thought about how the fishing industry is super isolated, or it's passed down through familial lines. A lot of people are I'm here to protect my waters, tragedy of the commons type deal going on where everyone's I don't want anybody to know where the lobsters are besides me because that's my livelihood and there's a competition to actually try and get these resources. However, even though fully a sixth of the people in aquaculture came from that isolation mindset that's in the lobster industry, that's not reflected in the aquaculture industry. There's a huge culture of supporting each other and making sure that the other farmers in your neighborhood are having access to the gear that they need, and people will meet up at bars after work and get a drink and talk about hey, I'm noticing this problem with mussel sets growing on my oyster cages and I don't know what to do about that. Are you also experiencing this problem? So there's a lot more communication happening among the farmers, and I was eventually okay, so why are so many farmers communicating when the fishing community is so closed off? That's not something that we would expect to see. And how is it affecting these adaptation strategies to have this community mindset? And I eventually kind of came to the conclusion that it's the presence of really strong organizations, especially in terms of long-term adaptation strategies. These organizations, particularly one that's through the Maine Sea Grant, which is funded by NOAA and the National Sea Grant. This Maine Sea Grant has a learning program or a teaching program called Aquaculture in Shared Waters that allows people who are interested in the industry to take a 3-month lecture series. And it builds a lot of community among the incoming people, and it also gives them a lot of connections to organizations that could help them with things like funding down the road and grants, and if they have access to research. So these organizations were kind of starting this little nugget of community among these people, and then it could grow from there and they could start having these connections on their own. And there's also some self-driven a grassroots type thing from farmers, but a lot of it did come from, I think, the organizations originally.
How did you jump from gender to environmental issue to a community issue in your thesis?
The gender issue was something that I dropped pretty early on, mostly because I just think that the questions that I could ask about gender, I personally just wasn't as interested in as the ones involved in climate change. And also, I just think that the answers were a little bit more straightforward, and I kind of wanted a challenge. But the community issue and the environmental issue are really ingrained together in my mind, because the community is how we're solving for environment. One of the big findings that came out of my thesis is that it's networks among farmers that is the major reason on how they're able to adapt to these climate change. Like I mentioned, there is this conversation, like the hypothetical conversation of people going out and getting drinks and talking about, like, it's called biofouling when unwanted organisms are growing on an oyster cage, which is just like a plastic or metal box that you set in the water and grow oysters in, and you can flip it up out of the sun to kind of like let the UV rays burn off and kill off any organisms that are growing on it to like maintain water flow through the bag or through the cage. And oysters are filter feeders, so you need high water flow. But these conversations about like biofouling happening among farmers are a huge part of the reason how they're able to adapt, is because they're talking to each other and being like, hey, I found this one strategy that works really well for getting rid of biofoul, and it's great for productivity because it's, you know, driving up the water flow in my cages and my oysters are feeding really well. And they'll go and talk to their friends and like people in their area about it, and then they're able to implement that strategy and maybe modify it and pass it along to the next person. So these challenges that are being exacerbated by climate change, like as the water gets warmer, more biofouling grows on your cage. People talk about these through their networks and they problem solve. So that's kind of where they're ingrained together. Is it's like community-driven education that people are passing around that's allowing these people to solve for like the short-term problems. When we get into long-term problems, that's a little bit different, and that's really where organizations come in. Organizations are like a big part of how people are solving for like long-term problems like ocean acidification. That's where you need like labs that are doing tests to kind of see predictive measurements on how that's going to affect, and they can kind of give reports to the farmers on like, okay, this is what our results see, so like maybe we can propose this strategy to try and mitigate that. And there's a lot, especially among research institutes, of this like iterative process with farmers and trying to answer farmers' questions. So a lot of these institutes have connections either directly with farmers or with other organizations connected with farmers, and the farmers can go in and be like, hey, I have this question about like how to grow oysters in this specific environment. How is that working? What is the most optimal way of growing them? Could we do like a multi-trophic thing where we're growing kelp and shellfish and maybe finfish down the line? Like, how does that work? And farmers can go in with these questions that like they want answered specifically, and then the research institutes can be like, okay, this is what the community wants. Let's see if we can find an answer to it. So there's a little bit of that going on too, and that also kind of helps drive these solutions because the questions are practical and they're applied.
Earlier you mentioned that you came in to read as a poli-sci major and you switched over to sociology, but you also have all these like multifaceted interests. So I'm curious to know, why sociology, why not like bio?
That's a great question. I specifically not bio because I like ecology and I hate genetics and cell development and neuroscience and just all of the other aspects of biology. So I was like, if I be a bio major, I'm gonna have to take all of these classes that I have no interest in and probably be miserable. So I don't want to do that. But I definitely do think that I have like a pretty broad variety of interests. Like there was a point in my life where I thought I was going to be an acting major. There was a point in my life where I always thought I was going to study statistics for a really short period of time before I came back to my senses. I don't know. I have a lot of interests, so I like interdisciplinary, which is, I think, kind of why I got drawn into this thesis, because I really wanted that bio, and the sociology department was not receptive to me being an interdisciplinary major.
And now, could you maybe take us to the first moment when you first heard about Reed? Or I guess my question is, why Reed?
Well, I first heard about Reed through my librarian in high school, and I was talking about wanting to go to school on the West Coast. I knew that I wanted to be as far away from Maine as possible. I was like, get me out of here. I need to see new places on the planet. And I was looking at schools in mostly California. Pomona was my top choice, and I got rejected, which is honestly I'm kind of glad about in retrospect, but I was very sad at the time. But yeah, my teacher or my librarian was like, my daughter lived in Oregon and had this, like, went to the school all the time and, like, walked around. And I think you'd really like the culture of it. So I looked it up. And when I was doing college tours out here 2 weeks before COVID hit, I did an overnight. And there was this one person, we did, like, a stay-in at a K-Rock show. And I accidentally arrived to the wrong show. It was full of freshmen, and they were like, no, just come in, whatever, it's fine. And afterwards, because they were like, well, you were already at the wrong show, so, like, why don't you just come hang out with us? And I, like, sat in Trillium with this group of freshmen, and we were, like, sitting there, and the main person who was, like, heading the conversation was like, and this is my boyfriend, and this is my girlfriend. And I'm like, I want to be here. Like, but it was like conversations with students who were, like, very frank and weren't the, like, canned administration, like, pitch that got me to be like, yeah, Reed would be a good place. And then they gave me, like, money. So that was good.
So let's go back to your thesis. You just graduated, right? I'm sure you still remember what it was like to work on your thesis. What was your process? What did an average day of working on your thesis look like?
I mean, it really varied by what point in my thesis I was at. I did a lot with, like, my thesis was very much what's the opposite of theory, I guess? My thesis was deeply empirical. And that was largely because I hate theory. I have always hated theory. Reading it is awful. Writing about it is awful. It's not for me. So my thesis focused a lot on my interviews. So it's a good thing that I had 18 hours worth of interviews to work with. My process towards the beginning, when I was really, like, my thesis advisor encouraged me to do the research portion that involves outreach and actually doing my interviews early on, because it can take a long time to actually get through people and set up the interviews and then go through them all and do the coding for it and try and, like, get the data pulled out of that you need to be pulling out. So I front loaded a lot of that, and I was proactive about it. I had my IRB submitted by early October, I believe. And it was me sending out emails, like, to everybody and trying to schedule as many interviews as possible before I went home that kind of took up the brunt of my first semester. So on one hand, it was a little bit of lit review, a little bit of theory here and there, but a lot of it was, like, schedule interview, do interview, transcribe all my notes from it, and try and maybe start picking out themes here and there. And that continued over break to a lesser extent because I was also on break and wanted to take a break. But yeah, my first semester was pretty heavily focused on data collection. And then my second semester was focused on writing. And I would set goals with my advisor each week and be like, okay, my goal this week is to finish the chunk that is just a description of all of the challenges that somebody can face from environmental change in an oyster community. I'm going to write that, and maybe then also I'll start writing my methods type of thing. So it wasn't necessarily like chipping away at it day to day because I'm a massive procrastinator. It was like, okay, this is due tomorrow. I have to write all of it. And I'd spend like 5 hours just doing that. And that's probably not the most ideal process. And the weeks in which I could manage to get myself to write it a little bit each day or incrementally put like 2 hours in one day and then like take a little rest in 2 hours the next day, those weeks were better for me. Everything was kind of exciting and surprising, and a lot of it was new. I came into this knowing literally nothing about the oyster industry. I knew nothing. I was like, I'm going to study kelp maybe. at the beginning, because I did a project once on algae biofuel, and then I had connections to the oyster industry and started studying oysters instead, and I had nothing. I was like, it's a shellfish, they're slimy and taste bad. But like, maybe that actually was my favorite part of the interview process, though. I'd never had an oyster when I started this thesis because I'm a vegetarian and I don't like shellfish. So even if I wasn't a vegetarian, I probably wouldn't eat them. But I was doing a farm tour and interview with this large oyster farm in Maine. And at the end of the interview, they were like, do you like oysters? And I was like, actually, I've never even tried one. And they were like, no. You have to. You can't do an oyster thesis and not have ever tried oysters. So the guy I was interviewing went out into the back with their freezers, and he was like, yeah, these are the ones that we pull, and they store them in freezers for, over the winter sometimes, to pull for storage, to sell for the year. But they're, very fresh, live oysters that they've been kept in this freezer. And he's like, 1 minute, I got you. These ones came off the farm very recently. And he went into his freezer, pulled out this oyster, shucked it in front of me, and then was like, here you go. So we cheersed, and everybody who I was communicating with, we all cheersed and had an oyster together. And then I had to, they were like, chew 3 times and swallow. Don't chew. Just swallow. It was so slimy. And I was like, it tastes like seawater. I don't understand why people like these. And I mean, admittedly, I think when people eat them, typically they have, I don't know, butter or something they put on them. And this was just a raw oyster. I was like, I'm chewing a living animal and it's like a snot ball. This is really gross. My girlfriend loves oysters, so she'd be all over that and she could have mine.
Now that you're done with this year-long project, looking back, do you have any advice that you would give to yourself?
I mean, I feel like the advice I would give to myself is you can be a little bit easier on yourself. I have a tendency to just be like, yeah, whatever I did, it's not enough. Could have done more, should have done more. I had the time to do it, but my brain was empty, so I didn't do it. And that was a conversation I had with my thesis advisor multiple times where it was like, Mark, today's the day I'm going to disappoint you. And he's like, you did more than I thought you were going to get to because you set unrealistic goals last week. And now we're going to set realistic goals. And then every week I would just not set realistic goals and be like, today's the day I'm going to disappoint Mark. I don't think I ever disappointed Mark, which was good. Honestly, Mark is interesting because everybody either loves him or hates him. But I think we got along. We're actually going to get drinks this afternoon. But I think the major piece of advice for me specifically is it's okay to breathe. It doesn't have to be perfect. This was something that when I was a sophomore, one of my senior friends told me. It was thesis really it's not as big of a deal as people make it. At the end of the day, you're getting 1 credit a semester. It should be taking up the same amount of time as any of your other classes because it's just a class. And yeah, it has a big final paper that you write at the end. But you're supposed to be writing that paper incrementally throughout the semester. Don't wait until the last minute to do it. That's just not going to be good for anybody. It should be just worth as much as any other class. And realistically, it's going to go into the thesis tower and maybe a read student or two is going to read it down the line. Your family is probably going to read it if you give them a copy of it. But unless you're doing something that's super spectacular and your advisor is you could get this published, most theses are really not as big of a deal as people make them. Read especially, I think they push this idea of the thesis, this cumulative process of your entire read experience, and it's this huge thing, and it is a huge thing in that it's a big accomplishment to write a thesis. It's really hard, and there's a reason why most colleges don't require it, but it's not that big of a thing. At the end of the day, it's just a big long paper, and if you picked a topic that you like, it's relatively fun to write, I think. So maybe that's my advice to other people, though, is I was lucky enough to pick a topic that I really liked, and that was a lifesaver. I had friends who hated their thesis topics, and they had a really bad time writing their theses because of that. So definitely pick a topic that you like.
It sounds like you had fun writing your thesis, but did you run into any unexpected challenge?
I mean, it kind of boiled down to just the things that I don't really like about sociology, which are theory. Like, I struggled my way through theory. It was really hard for me to write those sections because I just didn't enjoy them as much. So the theory, which really the actual writing of it should have taken me like a week or two, took me well over half of a semester to get through. And it was just like piecing together like a paragraph at a time when I felt like I could force myself to do it. And that was also probably from burnout. Like, that's another huge thing, is like people should front load their thesis if they can, because by the time that you hit the end of your senior year, you're like, I would like to crawl into a hole and sleep for the next 7 years. Like, the motivation just starts exponentially dropping once you hit second semester. So if you save the writing of the pieces that you hate for last, that's not maybe the best way to do it. So that was challenging. I coped because I had a really great group of friends who were also suffering beside me. So like, that was nice to know that I wasn't alone in my suffering.
What was the actual outcome of this project, and were you satisfied?
I think that I am actually quite satisfied with the thesis. I mean, the outcome is that I have a 107-page document that is now bound and probably going to be put in the library at some point soon. And I have a copy of it, and sometimes I look at it and be like, God damn, I wrote that. But I think that honestly, the most satisfying thing about my thesis is that my interview participants got a copy of it, all of them. That was like the last question I asked on my interview, and it was part of the protocol, was like, do you want to see this final project when it's done? And unanimous yes. In fact, I went to a conference also for my thesis, which is like 2 days of lectures and workshops about aquaculture. And I was talking to some people there about it, and like they also were like, yeah, just send it along. I'd be so curious to look at that. So that was pretty gratifying to be like, my research is interesting enough that people in the industry, including the organizations that I was working with, are like, we want to see this and we want to read it. And I had one PhD grad who was an environmental sociologist be like, you should probably publish that. And I don't intend to do that, but like that was a pretty like nice feeling to have somebody who's a professional in the field be like, this is an interesting enough thing that like it could be a publishable question. It was really satisfying though to send out my theses to all of my participants. And I'd say probably 75% of them emailed me back with being like, I'm so excited to read this, or like, this is really cool. Like, thank you for having me participate. And I had one guy email me back like 2 days after I sent it. And he's like, I read the thesis and it was really good. And I actually learned some things from it. And that was very satisfying to me, to be like, okay, I feel like if nothing else, I've made a contribution that's positive to this dude's life. And like, that is very gratifying. A major part of my desire to do this thesis was to be able to give back to this community, because I am a big believer of, if you do research in a community and you don't give them the results so that they have the information that you just like mined their resources for, like, that's an ethical failing. So I really wanted to be able to give back to this community.
And my last question is there anybody that you would like to thank for helping you out with the process?
Yeah, I mean, definitely my advisor. My project was, especially at the beginning, pretty shaped by my advisor, and his expertise in organizations was really helpful in me getting my theory base and shaping my questions. I probably just never would have written the theory section ever if not for Mark, so yay. And my housemates, I love them all. They're so wonderful. I've been friends with some of them for my entire time at Reed, and my other ones who I have met later than that, like, they're all just wonderful people. My family, they've been very supportive of me going through this process. I think it was hard on them when I decided to go all the way across the country, but you know, they've been very supportive of that, and I think that they're going to continue to be supportive of that regardless of whether or not I end up staying out here indefinitely or moving back home. So
those are all my questions. Thank you, Hannah, for getting on the podcast. It was so nice to have you.
Yeah, of course. It was fun being here.
Thank you, Hannah. I hope you don't blame me for exposing your mixed feelings on oysters. If you enjoyed today's interview, I hope you'll join us again to hear from more students and alumni about what it means to burn your draft. Be sure to subscribe, check out our X, Facebook, and Instagram pages, and write a review on Apple Podcasts. Burn Your Draft is a production of Reed College and the Center for Life Beyond Reed. Created jointly by students, alumni, and staff, this episode was produced and engineered by me, Reed College student, Ace Lackey. Our executive producer is Seth Paskin, class of 1990, with technical advising from Joe Janica. Our project manager is Nate Martin, staff member and class of 2016. Music by Jack Salvucci, class of 2020, and podcast art by alumni Henry Gottschlich and Liliane Pham. This podcast was made possible by a gift from Seth Paskin.